Today, I am really thrilled to have a special guest, Kevin Wagner, my old friend. Kevin is the chairman of the political science department at Florida Atlantic University, and he is also the author of Tweeting to Power: The Social Media Revolution in American Politics. Join us as Kevin and I take a deep dive into whether it's even possible to have a civil discussion about politics nowadays.
There's nothing inherently wrong with having different views on how to accomplish a policy, right? And yet somehow we've taken the idea that we have a difference of opinion into a character question.
You're listening to A Deeper Dive with Dara, a podcast by City and State, Florida.
Hello and welcome to A Deeper Dive with Dara Cam. I am really delighted to have a special guest with me today, Kevin Wagner, the chairman of the political science department at Florida Atlantic University. Kevin, welcome.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Kevin and I have known each other for many moons. So, Kevin, you're involved in something called the Civics Project, where you answer questions about government and politics in a weekly column that runs in the Palm Beach Post and other USA Today network newspapers throughout the state. And I thought it would be interesting to have you on as we're in the run-up to the 2022 elections. Unfortunately, maybe I'm a little late to the game with you because this episode will air on Monday, the day before Election Day. But let's take a stab at civics. And is it possible to have a civil discourse in politics anymore?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And in a lot of ways, the Civics Project was an attempt to see whether or not we could actually try and do that, to create sort of a space where people, no matter what their particular political beliefs are, could come together and have a reasoned conversation about how government, politics, participation, and democracy generally work. And so, we've been trying to do that for a while, and it is, it's a challenge, right? Because, it's become a very polarized universe that we live in. But I think in a very fundamental way, Dara, the real issue ultimately is if we can't have civil discourse, then democracy really doesn't function. And that's a real problem. I mean, Horace Mann, who's sometimes called the father of education, he wrote that it's an easy thing to make a republic, but it's a laborious thing to make Republicans. And what he was talking about was that it's not just, we can't just coexist, right? We have to actively participate in governance for democracy to work. In other words, we have to learn something about how government works. We have to learn something about policy to be participants. And I think one of the challenges for us is how do we do that in a way that isn't hostile, that is just open to the idea that people can disagree, and that's okay.
Well, it's interesting because we had planned this for quite the while, and then just recently, Nancy Pelosi's husband was attacked in his home by someone who was, out to get Nancy Pelosi, the second in line to the president, the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. I think that kind of is illustrative, not kind of, but it is illustrative of where we are in terms of the ability to even communicate safely. In this case, thinking about the January 6th insurrection, there's still over half, well, you're the pollster, tell me what the numbers are, but I think it's a majority of Republican voters around the country do not believe that President Biden was lawfully elected. How did we get here? I think I know the answer to that. Spoiler alert, Donald Trump. And can it be fixed? And that's a serious question. Both of those are serious questions.
I mean, those are tough questions. And, part of the reason that we got here, and I do some of this in the research that I do in political science, which is we're a product of the information we consume. In other words, whatever we're reading helps us shape and form our opinions. And increasingly, we're in a really polarized universe of environment, right? In other words, we tend to read things that we agree with, and we tend to avoid things that we disagree with. And it creates a real problem when we try to communicate with people that we don't agree with, right? Because we have no common language to speak. If some of us are old enough to go back and remember, when there weren't so many media channels, right? So there was a commonality to media, right? We all watched Walter Cronkite or whatever it was, and we could argue about what it meant, but we didn't argue about the basic facts of what happened. And I think that's what's really different today, is that we have an entirely different consumed sense of what is or hasn't happened. If you ask some polarized group what happened on January 6th, you're going to get some very different answers from people who saw it as one thing and other people who saw it as another. And, from my mind, it seemed pretty clear what happened, right? I mean, it was an assault on government. There's a good number of people who have consumed enough information to them to suggest, hey, this, wasn't so bad. And I think it's hard to have that kind of conversation across people when you can't even agree on the basic of what happened. And that's a problem. I mean, part of the solution, I think, to any of that is for us to sort of step outside our bubbles a little bit and look at information that maybe we don't agree with. I mean, everyone knows cognitive dissonance, even if they don't know that word, right? Which is that sense you get when somebody tells you something you don't want to hear, right? And you're like, I don't want to hear that. I don't want to be part of that, and we have to put that aside sometimes and say, let me see if I can understand the perspective coming from somebody else. And maybe we can have a conversation about it, even if we disagree with it. And obviously, that can't happen about violence. Violence is inherently, a problem. But about most of the things we disagree, I think reasonable conversations can happen.
That problem that you're referring to with the media channels, people, the way that I frame it is people only seek out the information that supports what they think they already know.
Yeah, and I think that's accurate. But that's only part of it, right? Is they seek out the stuff that they agree with, right? But they also discard the stuff they don't agree with.
Right.
And what's kind of interesting too is even when that stuff gets through, information that they don't agree with, it, they don't consider it. It automatically they don't consume it. In political science, we call that selective reception, which is they only hear the parts that they want to hear too. So I mean, it's a big kind of problem in multiple ways. It's not even just they're not exposed to it, but they're not even willing to listen to anything that is inconsistent with what they've already framed the world. And that's a problem in a democracy, especially a democracy designed like ours, which was designed by consensus, right? Nothing happens in the United States that isn't a product of some form of consensus. But if you automatically assume that everything the other side has is wrong, and that even compromising with them is unprincipled, then how does democracy function? I think we've got to step outside that box at some point, or we're just not going to have a functional government of any kind.
Is there research going on into how to break through that, how to be able to communicate with people in a way that will maybe stretch their ability to hear what they don't want to hear?
Well, yes, there is, and it's pretty challenging. And so far, what we've been able to determine in a lot of ways is what doesn't work.
What doesn't work?
Yeah, here's one that might surprise people, but here's what doesn't work: facts.
Damn.
Yeah, I know, it's crazy, isn't it? But if you confront somebody with factually, and so the way that we test this kind of thing is we get people and we ask them a series of questions, and then the experiment is you give you divide them into three groups, and you give one group information that's consistent with what they believe, you give another group information that's not consistent with what they believe, and then you give mix to the other group, and you try to see if there's a difference. And what they found was that giving people factual information that was contrary to what they believed wasn't persuasive. In fact, what it turned out to be is people would dig in. They would read this information and go, well, that's clearly not true, because I know. And
because I saw it on Facebook.
Well, some of that is right. So in a lot of ways, especially for those of you that are watching this before Thanksgiving, if you're going to try and persuade somebody at Thanksgiving dinner, and first let me advise you try not to. But if you were going to, don't confront them with facts. I remember I had a family member who has a very specific belief set. And I remember this family member said something. And generally speaking, I don't talk politics with family for good reason that everyone watching this probably understands. But this person said something that was so untrue. I just couldn't help myself. And so I said to them, that's just not accurate. And I said, let me tell you what we actually do know about this particular situation. And so I just went with pure factual information. And the person turned to me, and I still remember said to me, always with you facts. I have enough facts. I don't need any more
Oh my
facts.
gosh. Always with you, facts. Oh, I am going to have to roll that one out, Kevin. I mean, did your jaw drop, or was you, as a political science professor, this is already, but it's another thing when it's at your table, I'm sure.
Yeah, I kind of, we can't sometimes, even when we know better, we can't help it. And,
I
I
can't
should have
help
known
myself,
better.
right?
But, I couldn't help it because some things, it's just, it drives you crazy because you're like,
Sure.
that's just not
It's so
true. It's just
egregiously wrong that you
not
have to
true.
say something.
But yeah, it's really hard. One thing that we do know tends to work. There's two techniques that you can use. All right, here we go. So technique number one is to find areas of agreement. So in other words, something that you can agree about, and then push a little bit at the edges and go, well, we all agree about this, but how about this that's relatively close? In other words, inch them along a little bit on some of the issues that you can work with.
Like a training wheels.
Yeah, but the key here, right, is that you're not taking a contrarian position. You're talking as two people that generally agree about stuff, but there's some stuff that you could sort of, hey, what about this? And I was thinking about that. The other one is in political science what we call elite queuing, because we can't name anything simply in political science.
What is that? Elite queuing?
Elite queuing, yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Sometimes if somebody in your group that you respect adopts a position that is different, yeah, it will cause you to reconsider that position.
I gotcha.
Right. So you remember during the presidential campaign, I think at the Democratic convention, the Biden folks brought John Kasich in to sort of give a speech and one key moment, right? And what they were trying to do was sort of do that elite queuing idea. It was basically saying, here's a Republican, and he's saying it's okay to vote for me, right?
Right.
Which is a message that Republicans would be more receptive of when it comes from a Republican than when it comes from, say, Joe Biden.
Another spoiler alert. I don't think that worked, Kevin.
Yeah, well, I'm afraid that too many Republicans didn't see John Kasich as part of their group at that time, so it probably wasn't as effective as they had hoped.
But say you find someone who, I mean, and I think part of the problem, I was joking about John Kasich, but I think part of the problem with that approach now is that we are getting farther, we're driven farther and farther in our corners and tribally. And it's harder to find someone who might share an opinion that is a persuader, who would be respected by both sides. I mean, I'm not communicating well, but you know what I mean.
And that is a challenge, right? Because you and I are both old enough, and I don't mean to pick on our ages again.
No,
but
it's okay, because I'm older than he is, I'm sure.
We're both old enough to remember when there were pretty good arbiters of information that people on both sides trusted.
Yes.
Right? I mean, if you go back to the Tim Russert era, right?
Right.
Where where everyone sort of understood them as an honest broker. Not always perfect, but an honest broker. And there's very few people that sort of fit that sense anymore. And so you don't really have the fallback. Well, Tim Russert wouldn't report this if there wasn't some accuracy to it. And that's unfortunate because we really don't have anybody like that. But to some degree, one of the things that we also see is that the tribalism really becomes more important than the issues themselves, which also is kind of fascinating if you think about it from a political science point of view, but less so, than people actually honestly believe. And another good example of elite queuing, I think, is protectionism, right? Because historically, right, the Republican Party has always been more of a free trading party, and the Democratic Party, with its links to labor, has been more favorable towards tariffs and protectionism. But Donald Trump sort of switched that, if you remember, and he became, a person who supported greater degrees of tariffs. And if you looked at the public opinion numbers, Republicans went from not liking tariffs at all to being generally supportive of tariffs. Now, obviously not everyone, but that's kind of an elite queuing. That was somebody in their party saying, hey, I'm changing position. It's okay for you to change position as well.
But that was a little more complicated because that comes into this whole isolationist kind of, and then you get layers of racism and xenophobia and anti-immigration. I mean, so that's kind of a complicated example, but I guess they're all complicated, right? I mean, everything seems to be all threaded up in a big, ugly ball of politics, that any one issue seems to be related, or, there's like this trigger domino effect. When you talk about one issue,
Yeah, in fact, I even add this: the failure to comply in belief set with the range of issues that have become sort of the accepted way that we define these parties makes you persona non grata. And so increasingly, people being people, right, they tend to adapt themselves to the issue positions that their group has taken. And that's dangerous
you
too,
don't want to
right?
be an outsider.
Yeah. I mean, look at, if you look at somebody like Liz Cheney, for example, right? I think we'd all say, if you just look at her voting record, she's about as conservative a Republican as you can possibly find in Congress.
Right.
I mean, undeniably so, right? But she didn't agree with the former president, and that was enough, basically, to eject her, from the party. And I guess I picked on the Republican Party here a little bit here too, but that's also true of the Democratic Party, where if you're not central to the issues that the party is focused on, you're not seen as a legitimate member of the party anymore, and that has forced people to sort of adopt positions that they might not have done so in the absence of sort of this group pressure.
So you have to embrace all of our platform if you want to be one of the cool kids. Otherwise, we're gonna, we don't want you as part of our party. I mean, a party, small p.
Yeah. Not only do we not want you, we treat you as you're a bad person for not being there, right? And I think that's really getting back to the civics issue. That, I think, is really the hard part.
Stop shaming, folks. Stop it already. Enough with the facts. Enough with the shaming.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, right, there's nothing inherently wrong with having different views on how to accomplish a policy, right? And yet somehow we've taken the idea that we have a difference of opinion into a character question, right? The fact that you don't believe in the same type of solution that I do means that you're a person of bad character and that you're ultimately trying to destroy the country. And that's a really dangerous place to go. I mean, because in truth, a lot of the differences that we have are really questions of degree on issues like the size and the role of the government in delivery of healthcare, right? I mean, we fight about that as if the, depending on what degree you look at and how big a role the government should play is somehow a statement of the kind of human being you are, which is really inherently problematic. I mean, I'll make you laugh again. When I talk to European political scientists, especially those that don't study the United States, and they take a look over here briefly, they're always very confused by the hostility of our parties. And they come back and they go, I see two generally centrist parties here that don't disagree on a whole lot of stuff. Why do you guys seem to hate each other so much? And it's a fascinating question, because remember, in Europe, the difference between the labor parties and the really liberal parties are far more to the left than our Democratic Party. And the conservative parties actually come from traditional conservatism, right? From this, from the ideas that come out of the old monarchies and
right.
the idea that status and place in the country comes from where and how you were born in a lot of ways.
It's kind of bleeding over into the United States now too. But wait, so why do we hate each other so much?
Well, I think we stopped seeing each other as people that have different ideas that we need to compromise on, as people that are either for or against the country. And when you define it in those terms, it's really hard to cooperate. I mean, think about this, right? If you spent your entire congressional campaign saying that the other side wants to destroy America, you get to Washington, D.C., and you sit down with these people and you go, let's work out a compromise.
Yep.
How do you do that, right? How do you go back to the people that you just convinced to vote for you based on the idea that you were going to go up there and stop the terrible other people and tell them, hey, I got this really good compromise where they get something and I get something?
I mean, it seems like now we're going to be on this hamster wheel then. You've got one party in control of Congress and the White House, and they accomplish XYZ in over a 2-year period, and then another party will come in and undo all of that, and then, maybe maybe there won't be a hamster wheel. Maybe after the Republicans retake Congress in November, oops, yes, I went out on a limb and predicted that, that a Democrat will maintain the, that Joe Biden or someone else will continue to remain in the White House. Maybe not everything will get undone, but it does seem like we're yo-yoing. The pendulum swinging used to me, it took a little longer to swing. Now we're just, whiplashing.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things to think about in those terms. One is, historically, it didn't matter quite as much as it does today. And what I mean by that is that there was always an ability to compromise in a way that made the U.S. government function, no matter who was in charge. It's a pretty good book by a scholar named David Mayhew called "Divided We Govern," and what he points out in the book is that many of the major landmark pieces of legislation that we look back on and say, "Well, that was a very important piece of law that was passed," they were passed on a bipartisan basis. In other words, they worked it out in Congress, and they came up with a compromise that worked enough to get members of both parties to support the legislation. And so historically, we've sort of worked from that sort of at least when we needed to, bipartisan kind of way. We really don't see that today. I mean, even going back to sort of the Affordable Care Act, it's basically one
Right.
party has to get enough power in order to force through something because the other party won't compromise at all.
Yeah. I mean, it used to be, yes. And did we mention that we're old enough to remember this? I can remember when candidates would boast about being able to work across the aisle to accomplish things. Remember that?
Yeah.
And now, I mean, nobody's talking about that now. Now it's, we're right, they're wrong. We need to undo what they did, or we need to keep doing what we're doing. And there's no talk about compromise. So if the leaders aren't talking about compromising, how do we get people at the Thanksgiving dinner table to get to the point where they're willing to talk about compromising or rethinking their ideas?
Yeah, it's even worse in a sense that, if you throw in something like partisan gerrymandering on there so that we increasingly draw districts in a way that are either super conservative or super liberal, I mean, we incentivize them not to cooperate because of gerrymandering, right? Think about it, right? If I come from, and let's just switch parties for a second just to be a little more equitable here. If I come from a very liberal district, right, and I go to Congress, what is the only real danger that I will lose my seat is if somebody comes to the left of me, right? Because otherwise, I'm pretty safe. So I lose nothing by not feeling, not compromising. I lose nothing, right? Because I come back and I say, well, it was just too conservative. But if I compromise on something that becomes a more moderate bill, somebody can run to the left of me. And the same is true for somebody that comes from a very conservative district, right? If they compromise in some way and it comes back, well, you gave in to the liberals.
You get primaried, right?
Primaried to my right. Yeah. So the incentive structure is to not cooperate because cooperation could be potentially dangerous. And the one thing we know about members of Congress is that more often than not, you can predict their behavior pretty well by their desire to get reelected, right? So they're going to take risk-averse moves that make sure that they can keep their seat because it's a pretty good gig if you can get it, right?
You can take it to your grave, as we've seen in some instances. Okay, stick with us. We'll be right back. Fascinating discussion. Really, really happy to have you here. Kevin Wagner, poli-sci professor, Florida Atlantic University. Hang with us. We'll be right back.
Here at Deeper Dive, we want to hear from you, the listeners. We invite you to send your questions, comments, and feedback to our mailbag. You can reach us at deeperdive@cityandstatefl.com. That's deeperdive@cityandstatefl.com. Get your 2 cents in by sending us an email.
Welcome back to A Deeper Dive with Dara. Thanks for joining us. We are here taking a deep dive into how to be civil in politics with Florida Atlantic University political science professor Kevin Wagner, my old friend. Hey, thanks, Kevin. Thanks for joining us. I was asking some of my colleagues in the office if they had any questions for you. And one of them said, and this is the cleaned up version of their question, Jim Rossica the editor-in-chief of City and State, Florida, asked, why does social media turn people into trolls? That's the G-rated version of his question. What happens with social media? Is that a phenomenon that you've studied?
Yes. So I'm gonna pump my book here. I wrote a book called Tweeting to Power.
Oh, yay!
From Oxford University Press.
Yay. I'm going to run out and buy that right now. See, did I know that? Did I know that? Is that why I asked you?
But one of the things we did do is study social media and see what happens. I mean, one of the easiest way to explain it is to remember what the purpose of social media companies is and is not, right? And all of these platforms, fundamentally, you have to remember their purpose is to keep you on the platform, right? I mean, we know the old joke, right, which is that if it doesn't cost you anything, then you're the product, right? So, if you're signing up for any of these social media platforms, it doesn't cost you anything. It's because there's value in you engaging the platform. You become an audience for whatever they're selling, or for the data that they're gathering about you. Any number of those things are all true.
Yes.
So the purpose of the social media platform is to engage you, so that you will stay on the platform for as long as possible, so they can gather either data on you or they can market to you primarily. For most people, what these companies have sort of figured out is that certain types of emotional responses generate greater engagement, and you will be shocked to learn that one of those emotions is anger and fear. Right?
Anger and fear.
When you're angry or afraid, you tend to engage a whole lot more. And so the platforms are often designed in ways that will deliver the stuff that causes the most engagement. And so if anger and fear are causing the most engagement, then you're going to get more of that kind of stuff. And so one of the things that's happening in social media is that we keep consuming a lot of this angry, hostile, provocative material, a good portion of it, of questionable legitimacy, right? Or at least of questionable interpretation at any rate. And because of that, we consume that, and that becomes sort of how we see the world. And it's increasingly troubling. I mean, part of what we have to be able to do is we have to step away from that kind of stuff a little bit and say, hey, just because I saw it in my social media feed doesn't mean that that's an accurate representation of the way the world works. That's very, very hard for most people to do. It's hard for people, like I'm even aware of it, and it's hard for me to do. I mean, here's an interesting characteristic that you probably see all the time, right? People share stuff. You're ready for a weird observation about social media? People share stuff on social media all the time that they don't actually read.
Oh, no.
Yeah,
no, they do not. They don't.
The headline, right? And the headline says something, such and such a politician did such and such a terrible, right? And they already are predisposed to dislike that politician so much that they just go, that must be true, right? And so they send it off to their friends and family and anyone else that follows them without actually having read anything. It's a headline universe that happens on social media.
Wow.
And that's troubling. I mean, some of the social media companies have tried to address that, by the way. You may have noticed in whichever social media feed you use that, some companies do.
I use Twitter. I used to. I mean, I do today. I don't know if I will by the time this. Yeah.
Well, you might have to pay for your blue check mark.
Exactly. So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. But
no problem. But you might notice sometimes they will drop a little line and goes, "Would you like to read this first?" Before you send it off into your feed.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So, but they don't stop.
Twitter will definitely not be doing that now. Thank you, Elon Musk.
I mean, to some degree, there is a financial incentive for these companies not to just be the sort of social media version of a sewer, right? Because fundamentally, like a lot of them make money on advertising, and advertisers generally don't like to be associated with,
Kanye West,
sexism, violence, those kinds of things. And so there is a financial incentive for them not to be that. But it conflicts, of course, with the engagement algorithms as well. So you have some degree of competition between, do I give them what they want, but will advertisers flee my platform if I do? And so those are some of the challenges that the different social media platforms have to deal with, even some of the newer ones, like Truth Social, right? Having to balance that, delivering what the participants want with also being a forum that monetize in effective ways, and that's a real challenge for many of these. And the problem for consumers of information is that making sure that you're getting accurate information, and just using your friends and associates as the place to source that information may not be the best strategy for being fully informed.
Well, what do you think? I mean, since you wrote a book on using Twitter in the title, so what do you think about Elon Musk, firing all the fact checkers or whatever the people are that make sure that tweets are accurate? I mean, do you think that's going to change the political universe, or do you think that they will be forced to have to try to ensure that, or put up those warnings that these tweets might not be accurate? Or what do you see happening on that platform?
Well, it's tricky. I mean, I think one thing to remember is that despite the fact that a lot of us that study and follow politics, are engaged on a lot of these platforms, including Twitter, many Americans are not. It's a small fraction of people that sort of, get, so focused on these platforms.
None of my neighbors have Twitter accounts. None, not one. I've asked them all because that's what I do.
Yeah, and the young kids, they tend to be much more likely to find them either on WhatsApp or Instagram than you will necessarily on Twitter. Facebook is while it was, it's still sort of a giant market share leader. You'll see, some young people don't like Facebook as a platform, so they'll go somewhere else. So
I like to call it the Facebook just to piss off my daughter.
Yeah, well, is she on it?
Yes, she's on it. But I think the more that people of my generation use a social media platform, the more that those young folks run for the hills from it.
That's the truth, right? Once your parents or grandparents are on there, it's probably cool, right?
Cool, right.
I did ask my last class whether or not if anyone was on Facebook. I didn't get any takers. So
really.
Yeah, they were much more comfortable with Instagram.
Insta. You have to call it Insta.
Insta, TikTok, some Snapchat, right? So, I mean, there's lots of different platforms. So, if somebody watches this video, 10, 15, 20 years from now, it's archived somewhere, they'll be like, what were those platforms? I don't know what those platforms that they're talking about are. And so there's a certain dynamic nature to what is a popular platform. That's interesting.
Were they using Twitter too? Your students?
Not as much. I use it a bit, for, I teach political behavior.
Yeah.
It's a good place to sort of test out some of the theories, or at least look at some of the theories of political behavior. So I sort of, get them on there a little bit just to do some of the assignments that we do together. But yeah, I mean, we'll see. I mean, just ask all the people on MySpace how that's going.
For those of you who don't know, exactly.
But we'll see what the big platforms of the future are, and maybe if Mark Zuckerberg ever gets the metaverse working, maybe that'll be a big one of the futures. It's generally a little bit harder to know, but I do think that the one thing that is sort of constant about it that I think is interesting is that it has changed the way we consume news in a way that is very, very different than historically in the United States, right? So if you think about, most of our country's history, news was basically a one-way direction from the people that owned media sources to people who consumed it, right? So what was the old joke, right? If you never get in a fight with a person that buys ink by the barrel.
By the barrel,
right? And that that was a recognition of the fact that owning a printing press was a significant place in our media system.
Benjamin Franklin.
But
kids, look it up. Google it.
I probably should have known that. But today, of course, two things have changed, right? One is that anyone can be a media source now. You don't need the printing press or the barrels of ink, right? If you're a pretty good web designer, you can make a page that looks just as good as most major media pages look. And some people do, right? They create, pages that have names very similar to major media.
That's true.
They send out stuff, and people are like, well, I got this from the Post. Well, which Post was this?
They look truthy.
Yeah, right? So anyone can be a source of media. And the other thing, there's actually I could add two other things, right? One is the speed by which that information can be now distributed is much, much faster, right? I mean, you can go on to a lot of social media feeds and see things happening in real time in ways that historically we had to wait, sometimes days or till the next morning's paper came out to find out what really was happening in that situation. So the speed is much, much faster, and the interaction now is two-way. So not only do I consume it, I push back and say, well, this is what I think about that, and we create a more back and forth that goes on, rather than having any kind of real authoritative
dynamic exchange of information. And I think because of that two-way flow that shapes the way information is delivered to consumers.
Yeah, and now because of the way that we deliver it, it has to be really in very small chunks that are easily consumable. If
We're
you want
stupid now.
Right, viral, right? If it goes viral,
Right.
It has to be sort of short and pithy.
Right.
Long form journalism.
Okay, so
I
angry, short, and pithy, and scary.
Right. I mean, think about the old forms of long form journalism compared to sort of more modern outlets, like maybe it's something like Axios, right, which has really sort of gotten the art down to telling a story in one to two paragraphs, right?
Right.
I think when you click the tell me the longer story, it just adds another paragraph, right? So
Yeah.
I mean, in a lot of ways, it's all pithy. Even the long form is pithy, and where so just gonna show my age again. I can remember when if it was a really interesting article, it was okay for it to be several pages long. Because it was interesting and I wanted to know more about it. But that's not how a lot of people consume information anymore. So it's challenging. I wrote a column in the Civics Project about the legal challenge that is social media and how we think about it. In just getting back to sort of your original question, and part of the issue is what we think social media is, right, or is supposed to be. So typically, if somebody writes something, we hold them accountable for what they wrote, right? Or if somebody says something, that's sort of the libel, slander kind of notions, right? But we don't hold accountable necessarily the physical structure that holds the news, right? So think about it in terms of like I don't know if I'm going to say this well because people don't see this anymore, but when you used to buy a newspaper, there'd be a newsstand, right?
Yes.
Where the newspaper
that was
would
a
be,
little
right?
machine that you could put money into to buy coins. Remember coins? There was a person who stood behind a counter and you could buy this paper object. Jesus.
But here's the thing, right? We understood that the newsstand wasn't responsible for the content of the newspaper. In other words, if the newspaper had something in it, or whatever paper they're selling had something that was subject to liability, we didn't hold the newsstand liable because we understood they were receptacle for the information. They weren't the information.
Right.
And so that has sort of raised an interesting question when it comes to social media. Is social media a newsstand, and should they be liable for stuff that happens in their on their forum? Are they just a place where news is put down? And that was an interesting sort of challenge for courts, especially in the very beginning, of trying to understand: are they editors? Are they newsstands? And so the first distinction really became: are they editorializing at all? In other words, are they changing the content anyway? And some places had rules that said things like, you can't have, curse words, or you can't, attack people, and these kinds of things. And so the court said, well, that looks like editorializing, so then you're responsible for it. And Congress sort of fixed it, depending on whether or not you think it was fixed very well.
Right.
And they said that you're not an editor if you're, just enforcing, rules of your forum. And that's what really allowed the internet to sort of become, and social media become, what it is, because, they basically, can enforce a set of rules and not be, and still be treated essentially as a newsstand. Right. And, that's the big argument that former President Trump raised and others raised, is maybe that law shouldn't be that way, and maybe it should be different. But I don't know. I mean, in some ways, the internet, imagine if a social media platform was legally responsible for anything that was said or sent out in it. I mean, how could they function?
People would know what newsstands are again.
They'd have to I guess in some ways they'd probably have to screen everything before it was posted. I think that Elon might have to hire back a few people. To make that workable, right? I mean, even with all the people back, I don't think that's workable. And that's the challenge. And as a society, I guess we have to decide on what standard we want to hold social media to.
I think let's just set a standard of how about be nicer and not be so mean and scary. I mean, my job requires me to monitor social media more than I would if I were just a person at home not being a reporter. And it's exhausting. I mean, it wears me out just reading what's trending. Doesn't it to you? I mean, don't you feel that way or?
Yeah, there are times that, sometimes when I travel and people ask me what I do for a living, I tell them I'm an architect.
But does this ever happen to you?
It does get exhausting after a while, and like I tell people all the time, because people often get stuck in their quarters. I said there are good people in many different aspects of the political universe we live in. I've met many members of Congress. I've met elected representatives in the legislature, city council people of all different parties and backgrounds, and you'll find some of the best people trying to do what's right for their communities. And with very different perspectives on how to do that. And I think that's good. That's how democracy functions. I think sometimes you have to take a step back and realize that the vast majority of people that are trying to participate in politics aren't doing it because they think they're going to make something bad happen. They're trying to make something good happen. We just may disagree about what is good or not. And that's a conversation in a democracy we have to be able to have. Otherwise, look, if we can't talk about it, right, then what? Then where do we go from there? How do we have a functional democracy? What's the step after we can't talk? And I can guarantee you it's not a good one. So I just, at some point we have to be able to sort of think about policy as not a winner take all, death match. And I'm not sure how we get there other than start talking about that we have to do it.
Well, Kevin Wagner, Florida Atlantic University chairman of the Political Science Department, we are doing our bit right now.
Yes, we are.
Thank you very much for joining me today. It has been a real treat. Please promise me that you'll come back.
Absolutely. Anytime.
A Deeper Dive with Dara is a podcast by City and State Florida, hosted by Dara Cam, produced by Ryan Daly, and music for the podcast was recorded by Periodic Labs, LLC, and performed by Ryan Daly and Danny Reyes.